The year was 2143. The Earth we once knew, a world of sprawling cities, lush forests, and vast oceans, had long since faded into myth. Now, it was a charred wasteland, a testament to humanity's tenacity and its vulnerability. The skies above were no longer blue but streaked with fire, clouds swirling with the rage of a war that had consumed everything. The ground was scarred, cities reduced to rubble, monuments to a history that felt as distant as the stars themselves. Above it all, in the ruins of what used to be London, Commander Alara Stiles stood. Her boots dug into the ash and dust of a city that had once teemed with life. The smell of burnt metal and ozone hung in the air, as if the very atmosphere had been set ablaze. Yet, despite the chaos around her, there was something in her gaze, something that burned brighter than the flames that raged in the sky. Hope, a fragile, stubborn ember in the face of annihilation. The invasion had begun months ago, though it felt like a lifetime. The Othran, a race of cold conquerors from beyond the stars, arrived without warning. They didn't announce their intentions with words. They came with fire and fury, a tidal wave of destruction that swept across the galaxy. Earth was just another prize to be taken. To the Othran, humanity was little more than an inconvenience. But humanity wasn't going to go quietly. The Othran had underestimated one thing. They didn't understand the fire in human hearts. Alara took a deep breath, her fingers brushing against the cold metal of her command console. There was a subtle tremor in her hand, but she didn't let it show. Not here, not now, not when the fate of her world, of every living thing left on Earth, hung in the balance. She could hear the voices of her crew through the comms, the soft hum of their whispers mixed with the distant thrum of their weapons systems powering up. Commander, enemy dreadnought is entering range. The voice of Lieutenant Briggs came through the static, calm but strained. We're outgunned, outmanned. The fleet, it's not enough. Alara's jaw clenched, her mind racing through every possible strategy, every last hope. The Othran had come in full force. They were everywhere, and humanity was running out of time. But Alara had never been one to back down from a fight. We're not done yet, she said, her voice low, steady. The words didn't feel like enough, but they had to be. She was their leader, their guiding hand in this storm. They needed to hear it. They needed to believe it. As she turned toward the viewport, her gaze sweeping over the ruined skyline, she couldn't help but think of the past, the Earth they had once known. Her mind flashed to the people she'd loved, to the quiet moments of peace they had once taken for granted. Now, those memories seemed like fragile glass, something too delicate to hold on to. But then, something inside her snapped. No, not now. Not when the world needed her most. She wasn't going to let those memories die in vain. A tremor shook the Aegis, the flagship of Earth's remaining fleet, as it entered battle range with the Othran's dreadnought. Alara's thoughts sharpened like the edge of a blade. Every decision she made now would mean the difference between life and death. The view outside the ship's command deck was a violent kaleidoscope of fire and metal. Othran warships loomed in the distance like ancient titans, their sleek, alien forms blackened against the smoke-filled sky. The size of their vessels was staggering. The ships seemed to stretch into infinity, as though they were one with the very heavens, casting shadows over the Earth like a living nightmare. But the crew of the Aegis weren't afraid. They had been through hell, and now they were about to take the fight back. Alara, a voice cut through her reverie. It was Commander Kira Holt, her second in command, strong and unwavering. We've got incoming. Othran fighters. They're too fast. Too many. The radar screen flickered to life, showing dozens of enemy ships closing in on their position. Each one was a death sentence. But Alara didn't flinch. She had seen the impossible before. She had witnessed humanity's defiance in the face of insurmountable odds. The Aegis was down to a fraction of its full power, but it was all they had left. It had to be enough. Deploy all remaining interceptors, Alara ordered, her voice calm, but with the weight of 1,000 lives behind it. We hold them here, or we die trying. She turned to Kira, whose face was illuminated by the faint glow of the battle monitor. Kira's eyes were steely, a mirror of the commander's own resolve. This is it, isn't it? Kira asked, her voice tinged with both awe and resignation. The last stand. Alera's response was simple. If this is our last stand, then let it be one worthy of Earth. The intercom buzzed. Lieutenant Briggs' voice again, tight with urgency. Enemy forces are closing in fast, Commander. Shields are failing. Weapons are down by 40%. We can't take another hit. She gripped the armrest of her command chair, her nails digging into the leather as her mind whirled with calculations. Time was running out. The Aegis had been battered beyond recognition, and they were the last line of defense. Earth's final hope. She couldn't let that die here. Not like this. But then, a new voice crackled over the comm. It was the voice of Captain David Chong, stationed on the front lines of the defense grid. His voice was calm, but there was something in it, something wild, untamed. "We've got an opening," David said. "One shot. We can do this." Alera didn't hesitate. "Fire everything we've got. All weapons, full blast." The command was simple, the tension unbearable. The crew of the Aegis executed their orders with the precision of warriors who had fought together for years. Every shot, every explosion was a desperate plea for survival. But as the Othran dreadnought took fire, something miraculous happened. Their shields wavered. The unbreakable was breaking. Alera's heart pounded in her chest as the distant, thunderous sound of the Othran ships' collapsing shields reverberated through the Aegis. "We did it," Kira shouted. But Alera's gaze never left the viewport. There was still work to be done. The Othran weren't done yet. This battle was far from over. As the first barrage of human firepower tore into the enemy ship, Alera allowed herself a single breath. It wasn't much, but it was enough to remind her of the one thing she knew deep down. Despite everything, Earth would not fall today. Not while there was a single human alive to fight. The Othran dreadnought shuddered under the pressure of the barrage, its shields flickering. And for the first time, something shifted. The tide of battle had begun to turn. Against all odds, humanity had struck a blow. Alera Stiles stood at the helm of that turning tide, and for the first time in months, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, they could win. The Pacific was on fire, not the ocean itself, of course. That would have been too easy. No, the sky had been torn open, and the sea, that vast, calm expanse that once symbolized tranquility, now boiled in the wake of war. Alera Stiles, the commander of Earth's flagship Aegis, stood before a shattered viewport, watching the spectacle unfold. Her eyes tracked the Othran ships like dark, malignant stars that had found their way into Earth's orbit. It was impossible to look away. Each Othran dreadnought, gliding slowly through the atmosphere like something out of a nightmare, felt like the final exhale of a dying world. The vastness of the sky felt like it was closing in on them. In the midst of the chaos, she could feel it, the weight of what was happening, of what was about to happen. Humanity had been fighting for its survival for months now, but the grim truth was clear. The Othran were closing in. No reinforcements, no hope of help from the stars. They were alone. "Commander," came a voice from behind her, breaking her reverie. It was Lieutenant Briggs, his tone laced with urgency. "We're approaching the enemy fleet. Weapons are primed. But we can't do this alone. We don't have the firepower left." Alera nodded, barely acknowledging the weight of his words. They both knew the truth. Earth's defense fleet had been gutted. The ships that remained, like the Aegis, were barely holding together. "Do we have a shot?" Alera's voice was soft, but she held it steady, like the calm before the storm. Briggs hesitated, his fingers hovering over the control panel. "Maybe, but I'm not sure if it'll be enough. The Othran ships are too advanced. We can't hit them where it counts." A grim silence filled the room, the hum of the failing engines the only sound between them. The enemy dreadnoughts were closing in now, their sheer size dwarfing anything humanity had ever built. Each ship was a monument to their superior technology, their indifference to human life. Every second that passed was one step closer to the end. And yet, as the impending battle loomed, Alera couldn't shake the thought that had been gnawing at her. Not of victory, not of tactics, but of the ones they'd lost. Of the people she'd known before this war had torn everything apart. Her younger brother's laughter, the way the sun used to cast golden light over the fields back home, the comfort of a world that was whole. But now, There was only this moment, this impossible choice. Are we going to die today? Briggs asked suddenly, his voice vulnerable. Alara turned to him, her face grim but resolute. Maybe, she replied, but we're not going to die without a fight. That was always the thing with humans. No matter the odds, no matter how hopeless it seemed, there was a stubbornness that coursed through their veins, a refusal to bow before the inevitable. Alara had seen it in every soldier, every civilian, every child that refused to give up. Humanity, it seemed, could not be extinguished, not by the Othran, not by any force of nature. They had survived for centuries against the odds. Today would be no different. Deploy all remaining interceptors, she commanded, turning back to the viewport. If we're going down swinging. The words felt hollow as she said them, but there was a fierceness to them too, a desperation that she could taste. The Aegis was still a formidable vessel, but it was wounded. Its hull was cracked, its systems barely functioning. They couldn't withstand much more. She stepped away from the command center, her boots clicking against the metal floor as she made her way to the bridge, where her crew stood ready to defend Earth's last chance. Their faces were a mixture of determination and fear, as if they knew the odds, but were willing to face them anyway. Commander Styles, Captain Tanaka greeted her with a salute, though there was a weariness in his eyes that spoke volumes. We've launched the interceptors. They've engaged the Othran fighters, but we're outnumbered. Alara could feel the weight of every word, the responsibility for every life aboard the Aegis. She looked out the viewport again, watching the stars ripple with the light of distant explosions. The Othran had begun their descent, a storm of metal and fire descending on Earth's last defenders. Their ships moved in perfect synchronization, a deadly ballet that promised only destruction. Captain, how much longer do we have? Alara asked, her voice tight with tension. At this rate, less than 10 minutes before their main fleet breaches the atmosphere. If we don't land a decisive blow soon, then Earth is lost. Alara finished for him, her voice cold but resolute. The truth hung heavy between them. She didn't let her mind linger on the finality of it. She couldn't afford to. There were people still out there, waiting for a miracle, waiting for her. And so, she did what she always did. She focused on the mission. There would be no time for mourning, no time for fear. Only action. Prepare the main cannons, she commanded. Target their weak points, if you can find any. A murmur ran through the bridge crew, their faces tightening with the weight of the task ahead. But no one hesitated. No one balked. They were human, and that meant something. A heavy silence descended once more as the crew worked. The glow of the targeting screens cast their faces in eerie, green light, highlighting the determination, the exhaustion, the fear. Each of them had seen things no one should have to see. Each of them had lost someone, a parent, a sibling, a friend, and yet they stood here, ready to fight. Alara could hear the hum of the Aegis's cannons charging. There was something primal about it, something deeply human, a weapon made by human hands, a last, desperate plea to the stars. Ready, Captain Tanaka said, his voice trembling. The moment had arrived. Fire. The explosion was deafening. The shockwave rippled through space, a pulse of light that could have been seen from the farthest reaches of the galaxy. For a moment, time seemed to stop. The Othran fleet faltered, their formation briefly disrupted as their shields buckled under the human assault. But the Othran were quick to recover. Their own weapons fired in retaliation, sending waves of energy slamming into the Aegis. The ship shuddered, groaning under the strain. But they held, barely. They're returning fire, Briggs reported. The shields are at 30%. Alara didn't have time to dwell on it. She'd seen the carnage, the devastation, the lives slipping away with every passing second. There was no room for fear now, only fight. Give me everything we've got left, she commanded, her voice unwavering. We hold here, we hold, or we burn. And burn, they did. The Aegis launched another barrage, the energy from its cannons bright enough to blind the stars. And for a moment, it seemed as if the tide might shift. But then, another impact rocked the ship, and Alara felt it. The deep, horrible sense that they had already pushed past the point of no return. The Othran were relentless. In the distance, another explosion rang out, and a scream cut through the static. A ship had gone down. Alara closed her eyes. Not today, she thought. Not today. But she had no more time to think. The Aegis was buckling. Her people were fighting, were dying. And all she could do was hold the line a little longer. She wasn't ready to let go. Not when they had come this far. We fight. For Earth. For them. With that final, simple declaration, Alara set her jaw. There was nothing else to say, nothing left to do but to keep fighting to eye in the dim light of a makeshift underground lab. The air was thick with the smell of metal and sweat. Dr. Ava Pierce stood over a console, her hands trembling as she worked. She was a scientist, not a soldier. She wasn't meant to be here, buried beneath the ruined city of Paris, with the world above them crumbling to ash. But the truth was, there was no one else. The Othran had arrived, bringing with them a darkness that threatened to swallow everything humanity had ever known. And now, humanity's last chance at survival lay in the hands of those who could think, those who could still create. And Ava was a creator. Ava's team of scientists and engineers moved around her, faces drawn, their eyes hollow with exhaustion. They had been here for days, weeks even, working in the shadows to activate the forgotten relic that could turn the tide of the war. It was called the Forge, an ancient piece of technology, buried deep beneath the earth long before humanity had even begun to understand the forces it wielded. And now, it was their only hope. Ava's mind was a swirl of equations and formulas, her every thought focused on the task at hand. But even with all her intellect, there were things she couldn't solve. The Othran were closing in. The fleet had already begun to bombard the city. Time was running out. How much longer? She asked, her voice barely more than a whisper. Minutes, maybe, replied Jacob, one of the engineers. His face was smeared with dirt, his hands shaking as he worked. But there was a look in his eyes, a glimmer of something that reminded her they were still alive, that they still had a chance. Ava looked at the readout on the screen. The forge was almost active. The energy levels were spiking. A blue pulse of light flashed from the core, and for a moment, Ava felt a strange sense of déjà vu. She had seen this before, in the sterile confines of her lab, where the numbers had danced on the screen and the simulations had all pointed to this moment. But simulations had never shown her the cost of it, the truth of it. She swallowed hard, pushing the unease aside. There was no time for hesitation. There was no time for fear. She couldn't afford to doubt now. The forge hummed louder, its pulse growing stronger. Outside, the battle was raging. The Othran ships were in full assault mode. The human fleet had been crushed, and the city above them was falling apart. The streets were in chaos, the sky streaked with smoke and fire. And yet here, in this forgotten lab, Ava could almost convince herself that they were safe. Almost. We have to move, Ava said, looking over her shoulder. If this doesn't work, then humanity is done for. We're running out of time. But the team around her had no choice but to move forward. They had no other option. She knew that as well as they did. Just then, the sound of explosions shook the walls, rattling the very foundations of the bunker. A low growl of machinery beneath them echoed through the room. Ava's heart skipped a beat. The Othran had found them. They were closing in. Ava took a breath, steadying herself. Keep working. We need that core online now. They worked faster now, their hands moving with frantic precision. But Ava felt the pressure building inside her. Every second, every breath, felt like the weight of the world pressing down on her chest. She'd always been good under pressure, but this was something else entirely. The forge was humanity's last chance. If they could unlock its power, they could turn the tide of the war. But Ava knew something that her team didn't. She knew the cost. The forge wasn't just a weapon. It was a force of nature, capable of reshaping the very fabric of reality. It could destroy the Othran, yes, but at what price? The walls shook again, this time with greater intensity. The Othran were close. Ava's pulse quickened. She moved toward the console, her fingers dancing over the keys, inputting a series of commands. The machinery hummed louder, and the entire room seemed to come alive. The forge was ready, but as the final sequence triggered, Ava hesitated. She had a choice to make, one that would define humanity's future. Her mind flashed to the images of the world above, the ruins of Paris, the screaming voices of those she had left behind, the faces of her friends, of her family. Could she really unleash the kind of power the forge contained? There was a quiet moment, a beat, and then, without warning, a voice crackled through the comms, cutting through her hesitation. "It's time, Dr. Pierce," came the voice of Lieutenant Ross, one of the last survivors of the human military. "We can't wait any longer. Activate it." Ava swallowed hard. Activate it. She closed her eyes for a moment. Her fingers hovered over the console. She didn't look at her team. She didn't need to. They were all waiting for her. But deep down, she knew this wouldn't be just a victory. It would be a new beginning. Or perhaps the end of everything. In the final second, she pressed the button. The room shook violently. The light from the forge illuminated the underground lab with a blinding, white-hot light. Ava felt the power of it ripple through her, as if the very air had been charged with raw energy. The walls cracked, and the floor beneath them groaned in protest. The light continued to pulse, and the room hummed with an intensity that felt as if the universe itself was holding its breath. Outside, the Othran fleet faltered. Their ships began to shudder as if something beyond their understanding, had suddenly taken hold of their very being. Ava gasped. The power was overwhelming. She could feel it in her bones, in her chest, like a thunderclap echoing through her soul. The force of it nearly knocked her off her feet. But it wasn't just the Othran that were affected. The forge was pulling at the very fabric of the earth itself. The ground began to tremble violently, and cracks spread through the stone floor of the lab. Ava's team staggered, trying to maintain their balance. But it was impossible. The force was too great. "What's happening?" Jacob shouted, his voice strained with fear. "This isn't just the Othran." The lights flickered, the machinery sputtered, and then a terrifying sound filled the room, like 1,000 voices screaming all at once. Ava looked around, panic rising in her chest. It wasn't just the Othran they were up against. It was the very world itself. "We have to shut it down," Jacob cried, but Ava shook her head. "It's too late," she whispered, her voice cracking. "There's no turning back." She knew that humanity's last chance to survive had come at a cost. The power of the forge had altered something fundamental. It was no longer just a weapon. It was something far greater, something that had unlocked a force that could not be undone. The Othran ships in the sky began to shudder and break apart. One by one, their shields crumbled. Their hulls buckled under the pressure. But as the Othran fleet fell apart, Ava felt something deeper, a shift, a disturbance, a change in the very structure of reality itself. Something else was happening, something they had never anticipated. But there was no time to consider it, no time to question it. The Othran were falling, but at what cost? The earth trembled beneath their feet as the very nature of their existence began to warp. Ava's team gathered their strength, their faces pale, their hands shaking. They had done it. They had activated the forge. But in that moment, she realized that victory had come with an irreversible price. "I hope," she whispered to herself, staring at the chaos unfolding outside, "that we're not too late." The sky above Earth had always been a source of comfort. The familiar dome of blue, the endless horizon stretching out over the oceans, the promise of a new day every sunrise. But that was before the Othran descended like a plague, before the world began to fracture and burn. Now, the sky was a battlefield, a swirling vortex of smoke and fire. It had become the battlefield of a dying world, the final proving ground for humanity's resolve. The Aegis moved through the atmosphere like a wounded animal, its hull battered from the previous encounters. Alara Stiles, commander of the last human flagship, stood at the helm, her gaze fixed on the chaos that unfolded before her. The Othran fleet had been scattered, but their onslaught was far from over. Their ships were still out there, lurking like shadows in the burning sky. "Status report," Alara called out, her voice steady but strained. The weight of every decision pressed heavily on her shoulders. Every moment felt like a slow march toward an inevitable end. "Shields are at 18%, came Lieutenant Briggs' voice from the comms. "Weapons are offline. We're barely holding together. Commander, if we don't find a way to push back, we will," Alara interrupted, her voice cutting through the static. "We can't afford to give up now." Her eyes narrowed as she stared at the view ahead. A distant, dark shape began to form in the haze. A looming silhouette that was all too familiar. An Othran dreadnought, massive, unyielding. Its gunmetal exterior glinted ominously, and Alara could almost feel the malice emanating from it. It was like staring into the face of death itself. And yet, in the depths of her heart, a spark remained, a fire that refused to go out. "That's our target," she said, her voice quiet but resolute. "Give everything we have left." The crew moved in a flurry of motion. There was no time to waste, no time for fear. The Othran had underestimated humanity's capacity for defiance, but that didn't mean they weren't still a threat. This wasn't just about survival. It was about fighting for everything they'd lost. It was about fighting for a future that hadn't been stolen from them yet. But as Alara watched the crew scramble to get the remaining systems online, she couldn't shake the feeling of dread that gnawed at her. The battle had already taken so much. So many ships had fallen. So many people had died. And now, they were on the brink of the final assault. There would be no coming back from this. If they didn't succeed here, humanity would cease to exist. It wasn't just Earth that would be lost. It was every hope, every dream, every story of the people who had ever lived on this planet. The thought was suffocating, and yet, there was no time to dwell on it. The Othran fleet was closing in. They had come to Earth with one purpose: annihilation. They had arrived without mercy, their ships descending like vultures, their weapons burning cities to the ground. But they had forgotten one crucial thing: humanity's will to survive. The Aegis shuddered as another blast rocked the hull. The lights flickered, and the air vibrated with the force of the impact. The crew scrambled to maintain control, but Alara didn't flinch. She couldn't afford to. "Not now. Commander, we're losing power," Briggs reported. His voice was tight with anxiety. "We're not going to last much longer." "We have no choice," Alara said, her voice barely above a whisper. But she knew it was true. They didn't have time. They didn't have the resources. They had nothing but their will to fight. That was all they could rely on now. Another blast rang out, and the ship groaned in protest. The systems flickered again, and this time, Alara could feel the loss. They were losing everything. Her grip on the control panel tightened, her knuckles going white as she steadied herself. "Target locked," came Kira's voice from the weapons station. "But we're running on fumes. If we miss, we won't miss." Alara cut in, her eyes cold with determination. "Fire!" The sound of the Aegis's cannons firing felt like the final heartbeat of a dying world. The air seemed to crackle with energy, and for a moment, time stretched out as the powerful beams of light shot toward the Othran dreadnought. The ship erupted in a brilliant flash of light, but the Othran were far from beaten. Their ship took the blow, but their shields were still intact. And then, as if the universe was mocking their defiance, the Othran responded. A massive explosion rippled across the horizon, the shockwave sending the Aegis tumbling through the air like a fragile leaf caught in a storm. Alara's body slammed into the console, and for a moment, everything went dark. Her ears rang with the deafening sound of the blast, and her vision blurred. But then, slowly, reality began to return. Her breath came in ragged gasps. Her body ached, but her mind was still sharp. She pushed herself up, her eyes scanning the damage. The ship was buckling. The crew was wounded, and yet they were still alive. "Alara, we're still here." Kira's voice came through the comms, strained but steady. "But if we don't get the power back online, we're going to drift into the atmosphere. We'll burn up before we even get close to the Othran." Alara clenched her fists, her heart pounding in her chest. There had to be a way. There had to be something they could do. She wasn't going to let it in like this. Not after everything they'd fought for. "Lieutenant, how long until the backup engines come online?" she demanded, not taking her eyes off the screen. The Othran dreadnought was still looming, its weapons recharging, ready to strike again. Briggs' voice was tight. "At least 5 minutes. If we don't get the power flowing, we'll fall short. We won't make it to the target." 5 minutes. She didn't have 5 minutes. Alara's eyes darted across the battlefield, her mind working through every possible scenario. The Othran were relentless. They would not stop until Earth was nothing but a memory. But there was one thing Alara knew for certain. Humanity wasn't going to let that happen. Not without one hell of a fight. "Patch me through to the fleet," she ordered. "Commander?" Kira's voice came through again, uncertain. There's no one left. We're the last of the line. I don't care, Alara snapped. Patch me through. Now. A moment passed. Then the comms clicked. The voice that came through was heavy, burdened with the weight of survival. This is Captain David Chong of the Indomitable. Commander, we've been following your lead. What's our status? Alara's heart clenched. David was one of the last, one of the best. He had been by her side since the early days of the war. And now, it seemed, he was all that remained. We don't have much time, she said, her voice low but carrying. The Othran are closing in, and the Aegis is going down. We can't wait for reinforcements. We can't wait for anything. This is it. You have to make it count. There was a pause. Then David's voice came back, steady but heavy with grief. Understood. We'll give them hell. The line went dead, and Alara's heart twisted. But she had no time to mourn, no time to second-guess. All hands, brace for impact, she commanded, her voice sharp and commanding. We're going in. With one final command, the Aegis lurched forward, engines sputtering, a wounded animal charging toward its final confrontation. The Othran dreadnought loomed large, its weapons charged and ready, but Alara didn't flinch. She couldn't. Her crew followed her lead, standing tall despite the fear that gnawed at them. This was their last stand, the last chance for Earth, and they weren't going to let it slip away. The final barrage of human firepower rained down, and for a brief, shining moment, Alara saw it, the spark of victory. The Othran dreadnought's shields faltered, its hull cracked open, and for the first time, it seemed as if humanity's defiance might be enough. But even as the Othran ship began to crumble, Alara knew the truth. This was only one battle, and there were many more to come. The sky above Earth was shattered, but in that broken sky, humanity had found its voice, and it would not be silenced. The silence after battle was always the hardest. There was a kind of stillness that descended upon everything, as if the universe itself was holding its breath. For Alara Stiles, commander of Earth's final defense, that silence felt like a grave, cold emptiness. The Aegis had won a victory, a hard-fought one, but at what cost? The Othran dreadnought had been destroyed, but there was no time to celebrate. The ship was limping now, wounded and fragile, just like her crew. The damage was severe. The engines sputtered and groaned, struggling to stay alive. The power reserves were nearly depleted. The shields were down to nothing. And yet, there they were, still flying, still alive. Alara stood in the command center, her fingers pressed against the cold metal of the console. She could feel the weight of the world on her shoulders. Her crew, her people, had sacrificed everything to get to this point. And yet, the battle was far from over. Commander, we've got incoming, came Lieutenant Briggs' voice from the communications panel. His tone was flat, but Alara could hear the strain beneath it. There was always strain now. Alara closed her eyes, rubbing her temples. She had been expecting it. The Othran might have lost one of their dreadnoughts, but they weren't going to stop. Not until Earth was nothing but a charred, hollow husk. The war was bigger than one ship, bigger than one battle. How many? She asked, her voice quiet but steady. 2, Briggs replied, his voice steady as always. Their fleet is regrouping. They're coming in full force. The Aegis had given its all, and now there was nothing left. They were surrounded. The enemy was too powerful, too numerous. The thought of fighting again, of pushing through this final storm, was almost too much to bear. But Alara wasn't one to back down, not when she still had a crew to lead. She took a deep breath, grounding herself in the reality of it all. There was no time for doubt, no room for hesitation. The world needed them. It always had. And now, more than ever, they had to show the universe what humanity was capable of. Prepare to engage, she said, her voice low and resolute. We hold them here, no matter what. Her words hung in the air like a challenge. Her crew, battered and bruised as they were, didn't flinch. They had been through too much together to turn back now. They were in this, for better or worse, until the end. But even as Alara gave the command, a nagging thought tugged at the back of her mind. The Othran had always been ruthless. They were a force unlike anything humanity had ever faced before. They had come for one purpose: destruction. They weren't just invading Earth. They were trying to erase it, to erase everything humanity had built. And Alara knew that the stakes were higher than ever. If they didn't win this battle, humanity wouldn't survive. The Othran weren't here to negotiate. They weren't here to make peace. They were here to annihilate. A chill ran down Alara's spine as she watched the scanners. The Othran ships were drawing closer. There was no more running, no more hiding. The final stand was upon them. Weapons systems are offline, Briggs said, his voice strained with the weight of the situation. We've got nothing left. We can't win this fight. Alara's gaze flicked to the viewport. The enemy fleet was closing in fast, their sleek, alien vessels gleaming ominously against the backdrop of space. It was a sight that struck fear into the hearts of even the bravest. But Alara knew one thing for certain. If this was their last stand, it wasn't going to be easy for the Othran. We're not dead yet, she said, her voice steady, unwavering. There's always a way. She looked around at her crew, seeing the same fear and uncertainty that she felt in her own chest. But they were soldiers. Every one of them had been through hell. And now, they had one last fight ahead of them. Commander Kira Holt, her second in command, stepped forward, her voice tight with emotion. We can't keep going. We don't have the firepower, the shields. We're running on fumes. Alara didn't say anything at first. She just looked at Kira, her eyes meeting hers. There was an understanding there, a bond forged through endless battles, through loss, and through survival. Kira was right. They were out of options, but that didn't matter. Not now. Then we fight with what we've got, Alara said softly. We fight until we can't anymore. The crew nodded, their faces grim but determined. They had come this far. They had lost so much. And now, they had to finish it. There was no grand plan, no secret weapon hidden away, no miracle waiting to save them. There was only one thing they could rely on, the raw will to survive. The Othran fleet was upon them now, closing in fast. Alara's heart hammered in her chest as she watched the massive ships loom overhead. The silence in the command center was broken only by the hum of the failing systems. And then, just as it seemed like the end was inevitable, something changed. It started as a faint pulse, a ripple in the air that no one could explain, a strange, buzzing sensation, like an electric charge that filled the room. Alara's hand instinctively moved to the console, her fingers hovering over the controls. Commander? Kira's voice cut through the air, confusion lacing her tone. What's happening? I don't know, Alara said, her voice barely above a whisper. But something's wrong. The pulse intensified, growing stronger with each passing second. The walls of the Aegis seemed to vibrate, as if the ship itself was alive. Alara's breath quickened. She could feel it now. The power, the raw energy that seemed to be surging through the ship. Briggs, she called, her voice urgent. What's going on with the power systems? Briggs was silent for a moment, his fingers flying over the console as he worked to process the data. It's not supposed to happen. The power's coming back online. Everything. Weapons, shields, engines. It's like the ship's been recharged. Alara's eyes widened. It was impossible. They were running on empty. There was no way the ship could be powering up again. Not after everything they had been through. And yet, here it was. And then, just as the Othran ships prepared to fire, the Aegis's weapons systems came to life. A massive surge of energy shot from the cannons, slicing through the enemy ships with pinpoint precision. Alara's heart skipped a beat as the first Othran ship exploded in a burst of light, its wreckage spinning out into space. We're not dead yet, Alara murmured to herself, barely able to believe what was happening. The impossible was happening. The crew erupted in cheers, but Alara's mind was racing. How was this possible? Was it the forge? Was there some residual energy, some leftover power from the ancient device? She didn't know, but she couldn't afford to dwell on it. The Othran were still coming. There were still 2 more dreadnoughts waiting in the wings. We have to finish this, she said, her voice rising above the noise of the crew. We fight until we can't anymore. The Aegis surged forward, its weapons firing relentlessly. Another Othran ship fell, and then another. The tide was shifting. The power was coursing through them, and Alara could feel it. The strength of their ancestors, the fire of every human who had ever fought for their future, now flowing through the ship. But even as the battle raged, even as they took down Othran ship after Othran ship, Alara couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The energy coursing through the Aegis was too much, too powerful. There was something deeply unsettling about it. Was it the last gasp of humanity, or had they unleashed something far greater than themselves? As the final Othran dreadnought exploded in a blinding flash of light, Alara knew one thing for certain. This was only the beginning. The battle was won, but the war was far from over. And the price of victory? That was yet to be paid. The aftermath of victory was always quieter than Alara had imagined. When the Othran fleet had finally been reduced to nothing more than floating wreckage, there had been no triumphant cheers, no grand celebrations. Just a heavy, oppressive silence that settled in the aftermath. The Aegis had won, yes. The Othran had been forced to retreat, their once unbreakable armada now scattered and burning in the vast, cold emptiness of space. But in the quiet of the command center, Alara knew the truth. It wasn't enough. The war was far from over. The Othran might have retreated for now, but they had only been driven back. The devastation they had left behind on Earth, the people they had taken, the cities they had reduced to dust, it was a wound that could never truly heal. Alara stood before the viewport, staring out at the black void of space, her thoughts distant. She had seen the horrors of this war, felt the weight of every life lost, and even in the quiet of this small victory, there was a part of her that knew something had changed in the universe. Something deep, something irrevocable. What now, Commander? Kira Holt, her second-in-command, asked, her voice low and filled with a mixture of exhaustion and uncertainty. Alara turned slowly to face her, the question she had been avoiding hanging in the air. What now? They had defeated the Othran in this battle, but the cost had been steep. The Aegis was badly damaged, barely holding together. Their resources were depleted. And Earth? Earth was a world broken beyond recognition. We keep fighting, Alara replied, her voice unwavering, but a tightness in her chest betrayed her true feelings. This battle might be over, but the war isn't. Not by a long shot. Kira nodded, but her eyes were haunted. But what if they come back? What if the next wave is worse than what we've seen? Alara didn't have an answer for that. No one did. The Othran had proven their relentless desire to destroy Earth. They had seen it firsthand. The way they had torn through humanity's defenses, erasing everything in their path. The truth was, humanity had no guarantees. There was no safe haven, no place to hide. They were just one shattered planet in a vast universe of uncaring stars. And yet, there was something undeniably human in the way they kept fighting. It was in their blood, their hearts, their very souls. The unwillingness to surrender, to lay down and die without a fight. All systems report operational. Briggs' voice came over the comms, cutting through the tension. But I don't need to tell you we're running on fumes, Commander. We can't keep this up forever. Alara's gaze flicked over to the console. There was truth in Briggs' words. The Aegis had taken a beating, more than any ship should have survived. The power systems were barely holding together. The shields were a mere flicker of what they had been, and the weapons had been drained dry. Yet, here they were, alive, still standing, against all odds. She felt the weight of her responsibility like a stone pressing down on her chest. I know, she said quietly. We have a few hours before we need to find a way back to Earth. I'm not going to lie to you all. This is a temporary fix. But I'll be damned if we don't use every last ounce of strength to make sure we have a fighting chance. A pause hung in the air. Then Kira, ever the pragmatist, stepped forward. What do we do now? Earth needs us. There's no way to know what shape the planet's in after the Othran onslaught. Alara clenched her fists. She didn't know. She had no way of knowing. All she had were the fragmented reports from the last battle, from survivors who had escaped in the chaos. And the reports weren't good. Cities were burned to the ground. Millions had perished, and those who remained were either hiding in the ruins or had been taken by the Othran for some unknown purpose. Her eyes drifted back to the viewport. Earth was a world on the brink of destruction. She had seen it in the faces of the people who had survived. They looked like ghosts, hollow-eyed and lost, trapped in the ruins of what had once been their home. And yet, even in the aftermath, they had held on to something. Hope, maybe? Or just the raw, primal need to keep moving, keep living, no matter the odds. We head back to Earth, Alara said after a long silence, her voice firm with resolve. We rebuild, we regroup, and we prepare for whatever comes next. Kira raised an eyebrow, her lips pressed into a thin line. Rebuild? With what? We don't even have the resources to patch up the Aegis. How are we supposed to rebuild a planet? Alara smiled, though it was a bitter thing. We start with what we have. We fight with whatever we've got left. And if that's not enough, we find a way to make it enough. Kira didn't answer, but there was an unspoken understanding between them. There was no magic solution, no quick fix. But humanity had always been a species defined by its ability to overcome. They had fought wars for centuries, built civilizations, torn them down, and rebuilt again. They had always managed to find a way, even in the face of impossible odds. In the distance, Earth beckoned, a tiny, fragile blue orb, spinning in the darkness of space. Alara could almost feel the weight of its gravity, the pulse of life that still flickered below its surface, a world on the edge of collapse. Do you ever think about what comes after all this? Kira asked softly, breaking Alara's reverie. Alara turned to face her. What do you mean? Kira hesitated, her gaze drifting down to the floor. I mean, after the Othran are gone, after we've won, what happens to us? What happens to humanity? Will we rebuild? Or will we fall apart like we always do after wars? Alara was silent for a long time. Kira's question echoed in her mind, pulling her into a moment of deep reflection. She thought about the world they had known before all this. She thought about the people, the cities, the lives that had once been so full of promise. And she wondered, like Kira, whether humanity would ever be able to come back from the destruction they had endured. But then, she thought about the people still fighting, the survivors, the ones who had refused to let go, the ones who had risen from the ashes time and time again, the ones who still held on to that impossible hope, that raw determination. No matter what happens, Alara said, her voice steady, we rebuild, not just the planet, but the spirit of humanity. We rebuild everything that's worth saving, not because it's easy, but because we can't let them win, not after everything we've lost. Kira looked up at her, her expression softening. I hope you're right. We'll find a way, Alara said, her words filled with a certainty that surprised even her. We always do. The Aegis began its slow journey back toward Earth. There was still so much to do, so many battles yet to fight. But in this moment, Alara allowed herself the briefest flicker of hope. Humanity had been knocked down time and time again, but it had always stood back up. They had faced the Othran and survived, and they would face whatever came next, because that was what humans did. They fought, they survived, and they built. The stars seemed to blink in acknowledgement of their resolve, silent witnesses to the legacy of humankind, a species that, even in the face of annihilation, refused to be broken. And for the first time in a long while, Alara allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, they had a future worth fighting for. The Earth that Alara Styles had once known was gone. In its place, a shattered landscape stretched before her, a broken world that seemed to exist only in fragments of memories. It was a world still teetering on the edge of collapse, but one that had refused to give up. Humanity had lost so much, but there was still something left, something deep within, something that could never be fully extinguished. Alara stood at the edge of what had once been Paris, the city of light now reduced to a smoldering ruin. What remained of the Eiffel Tower was a skeletal frame, blackened and twisted by the inferno that had raged through the city. The streets below were silent, save for the distant echoes of wind and the occasional thud of collapsing debris. This was Earth's last wound, but it wasn't the final one. Not yet. Her boots crunched over the ash, the air thick with the smell of charred earth and metal. For a moment, she closed her eyes, imagining what it had been like before. The laughter of children, the hum of conversation, the energy of a world full of life and possibility. It seemed so distant now, as if it belonged to someone else, to another time. And yet, it was all still there, buried deep beneath the rubble. The memories, the people, they lived on in the survivors, in those who refused to let the Othran and the devastation they had caused take everything. Alara, Kira's voice cut through her reverie, pulling her back into the present. Alara turned to face her second-in-command, who had just stepped into the clearing. Kira's expression was grim, her eyes reflecting the weight of what they had seen. She had been by Alara's side from the beginning, had fought in every battle, stood firm in the face of every setback. But today was different. Today, the burden of survival felt heavier than ever. "We've secured the area," Kira said, her voice low, "but we still don't have the full picture. There's no telling how many survivors are left in the region. We need to start organizing relief." Alara nodded, but her gaze drifted back to the ruins. Relief. She repeated the word, the hollow echo of it in her mind bringing a bitter taste to her mouth. It felt like a cruel irony. The word itself felt so hollow in a world so far from relief. What could they offer? What could they rebuild from the ashes of a planet ravaged by an unstoppable enemy? Her mind was heavy, weighed down by questions that had no answers. What was the point of it all? Would Earth ever return to what it had been? Or was this just the beginning of the end? Could humanity recover from the Othran's devastating assault? Could they find hope again? "You're thinking too hard," Kira said, stepping closer, her voice gentle but firm. "You're carrying all of this on your shoulders like it's your fault. We're in this together." Alara exhaled slowly. She had always carried the weight of command with a certain sense of pride, a fierce determination to keep going no matter what. But it was moments like this, when she stood among the ruins of a fallen world, that the weight felt unbearable. She had led her crew through countless battles, fought tooth and nail for every scrap of survival. But now it felt like the end. There was nothing left to fight for, nothing to rebuild except empty land and memories. "I just keep wondering if it was all worth it," Alara confessed quietly, her voice trembling ever so slightly. "If we've done enough, or if we've already lost." Kira's eyes softened as she placed a hand on Alara's shoulder. "Don't say that. We're still here. We're still breathing. As long as we're alive, there's still a chance." Alara didn't respond right away, her gaze locked on the horizon. She could hear the distant hum of the Aegis in the background, its engines still running weakly, just enough to keep the ship in orbit. The crew, those who had survived, were beginning to sift through the wreckage of the cities, searching for any signs of life, any signs of hope. But what would they find? A world half dead, or a flicker of life fighting to survive? "I keep thinking about the people we've lost," Alara said softly. "I think about the families, the children who'll never see the sun rise again. And I can't help but feel that everything we've done has been for nothing." Kira stayed silent, her eyes never leaving Alara. There were no words to offer that would make the pain go away, no comforting thoughts that would ease the burden. But there was something in Kira's presence, something unspoken, that reminded Alara that she wasn't alone. "Not really. Maybe it's not about the people we've lost," Kira said after a long pause. "Maybe it's about the ones we've saved. We still have a chance to rebuild. We still have a chance to make it right." Alara turned to her, studying her second-in-command's face. There was fire there. It was a spark, small, flickering, but it was still there. And in that moment, Alara realized something. It wasn't about winning every battle or saving every life. It was about moving forward, about finding meaning in the struggle, no matter how hopeless it seemed. The fight had never been about perfection. It had always been about survival. "What do we do next?" Alara asked quietly, her voice steady now. Kira smiled, a faint glimmer of something like hope lighting her eyes. "We go back to work. We find the survivors. We help them rebuild. And we prepare for whatever comes next." Alara nodded slowly. There was no easy way forward, no guarantee of victory. But there was something in the way Kira spoke that stirred something deep inside her. The spark that had driven humanity for centuries. The will to survive, to keep going, no matter the odds. It was that same spark that had burned in every survivor, in every fighter, in every soul who had refused to be extinguished. "I'll make sure the Aegis is ready," Alara said, turning to walk back toward the ship. "We'll find a way to bring this planet back." Kira followed closely behind her, the two of them walking in silence. As they reached the ship, Alara stopped for a moment, her eyes scanning the horizon one last time. Earth was broken, but it wasn't gone. Not yet. There was still a chance. In the distance, the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting the ruins in an eerie golden light. It was a strange, almost peaceful sight, the calm before the next storm, perhaps. But for now, there was something reassuring in it, something human. The sun would rise again, as it always had, and as long as it did, there was hope. "Let's get to work," Alara said finally, the weight of the world on her shoulders, but a renewed sense of purpose in her heart. The past was gone, but the future? The future was theirs to rebuild, and they would. As the crew began their work, pulling together what little resources they had left, Alara knew there was no turning back. There would be no easy path, no quick solutions. The road ahead would be long and difficult, but if there was one thing humanity had proven, time and time again, it was this. No matter how broken the world was, there would always be those who refused to give up, and as long as they had that, they would keep moving forward. The weight of the past would always be there, a shadow that followed them wherever they went. But the future? The future was theirs to shape, and Alara was ready to take the first step into it. The sky above Earth was a canvas of endless twilight. It hung like a veil over the ruins, its colors dimmed by the smoke rising from the shattered cities below. For Alara Styles, it felt like the world was holding its breath, like everything was caught in a moment of suspended animation, waiting for something to change. The war with the Othran had taken so much, had broken the very heart of humanity. Yet here she was, standing at the precipice of an unknown future, her crew behind her, and the remnants of a devastated world before her. The Aegis hovered just above the charred landscape of what had once been London. The ship's hull was scarred, its engines still barely functional, but it was there, still there, a testament to everything they had endured, everything they had fought for. "Alara, the scouts are reporting in." Kira Holt's voice came through the comms, pulling Alara from her thoughts. "They've found survivors in the ruins of the city, but it's not what we expected." Alara's heart skipped a beat, but she didn't allow herself to show it. There had been whispers of survivors, of people hiding in the shadows, waiting for rescue. But what Kira was implying, it could be something more, something worse. "What do you mean? Not what we expected?" Alara asked, her voice steady despite the churn of unease in her chest. "They've been organized," Kira replied. "It's not just random survivors trying to find safety. There's a group, a faction. They've been taking control of parts of the city, armed, and they're not exactly friendly." Alara's mind raced. After everything they'd been through, after the Othran had ravaged their world, now there was something else to contend with. It felt like the universe was mocking them, like it was testing just how much they could take. "Are they human?" Alara asked, the question on the tip of her tongue, almost too painful to ask. "Yeah," Kira said, voice tight. "But there's something different about them. It's like they've adapted. They're too ready for this, too organized. They're not just surviving. They're rebuilding their own version of this world, and they don't want anyone else getting in their way." Alara felt a strange wave of anger and confusion. Who were these people? What right did they have to take control of what was left of their world? Humanity had already lost so much, and now they were going to tear each other apart for what? For power? How many? Alara asked, her voice hard. "Enough to make a difference," Kira said. "They're concentrated around what used to be the government center. They've set up barricades, patrols. It looks like they've been waiting for us." Alara clenched her fists. She knew what had to be done. She knew they couldn't just ignore this. They had already seen what people were capable of when pushed to the brink, when survival was the only thing that mattered. But this was something else entirely. They weren't just fighting for survival anymore. Now, it was about reclaiming what was theirs, what was rightfully humanity's. "We move out at first light," Alara said, the words coming out with an edge of finality. "We confront them, but this time, we're not just fighting the Othran. We're fighting for our future. We're fighting for humanity." Kira's voice softened. "You really think they'll listen? After everything we've been through? They may not care about what we're trying to rebuild. They might only want what's left. Then we'll show them that we still have something worth fighting for," Alara replied, her voice firm. "We'll remind them what it means to be human." The next morning, the team was ready. The Aegis had managed to repair some of its systems, though it was far from perfect. They had enough energy to make a final push, but not much more. Alara knew they were running on borrowed time. Every moment that passed meant they were that much closer to the point of no return. They had to end this. They had to take back what was left of the world before it slipped further into chaos. The journey through the city was harrowing. The streets were empty, save for the occasional flicker of movement in the shadows. The buildings, once symbols of human ingenuity and ambition, were now hollowed-out skeletons, their glass facades shattered, their steel beams twisted and torn like broken bones. As Alara's team moved deeper into the city, it felt like they were walking through a graveyard, a tomb for the civilization that had once thrived here. They came to a stop at a high vantage point, overlooking what had once been the heart of the government. The old parliament buildings, now reduced to rubble, loomed in the distance. But there, amid the debris, something else had taken root. A fortress of sorts, high walls, guarded entrances, and a heavy presence of armed figures patrolling the perimeter. "Are we sure this is the right place?" Kira asked, her eyes scanning the horizon. Alara nodded slowly, her heart pounding in her chest. She had been here before, not physically, but in her mind. She had imagined this moment, the confrontation, the standoff. What would it be like to face not only the Othran, but humans who had become something different in the aftermath of everything? What would it feel like to fight for the future, for the survival of what was left? "We do this carefully," Alara said, her voice steady. "We don't know what we're up against, but if they want to fight, they'll get one." Kira glanced at her, her face hardening. "I don't think this is just a fight anymore, Alara. This feels like something else." Before Alara could respond, there was a flash of movement at the far side of the ruins. A figure stepped into view, tall and imposing, with the unmistakable stance of someone used to being in charge. He raised his hand, signaling his people to hold. Alara's heart skipped a beat. This was it. She stepped forward, hand resting on the blaster at her side. "This is humanity's last stand," she muttered to herself, more to ground herself than anything else. The figure at the front of the barricade spoke, his voice booming across the ruins. "You're late." Alara's eyes narrowed, her hands steady as she clasped her weapon tighter. "Who are you? Who am I?" The man chuckled darkly. "I am the one who saved what's left of humanity. The one who recognized that Earth couldn't just be rebuilt with hope. It needed something more. It needed control." "What are you talking about?" Alara asked, confusion mixing with her anger. "You're not saving anyone. You're hoarding what's left." The man's eyes glinted with something darker. "I'm not hoarding anything. I'm building something new. A world where survival isn't left to chance. Where there are no weak, no helpless. We've lost too much to keep playing the old game." "Playing the old game?" Alara's voice rose in fury. "You think this is some game? The only game here is survival, and we'll fight for that. You don't get to decide who survives or not. This isn't your world anymore." For a moment, the silence between them was deafening. Alara could feel the weight of his gaze, a coldness that cut through her. She knew he was dangerous. She knew he wasn't just another survivor. This man was a predator, and his vision of the future was far more brutal than the Othran could have ever imagined. But there was something inside Alara, something that refused to be crushed, something that burned brighter than ever. She wasn't going to let him take the last remnants of hope, not while she still had breath in her body. "This world," Alara said, her voice steady now, "doesn't belong to you. It belongs to every person who's fought to survive. It belongs to those who still believe in something better." The man laughed again, his smile bitter and knowing. "And what's better, Commander? What's left to save? A planet turned to dust? A broken civilization? Tell me, what's worth saving?" Alara looked back at her team, her eyes meeting Kira's. In that moment, she saw it. The spark, the last flicker of humanity. It wasn't about the planet, the cities, or even the fight. It was about the will to live, the unshakable need to keep going no matter the cost. "It's humanity," Alara said softly, almost to herself. "It's always been humanity." The battle for Earth had begun, and no matter what this man had built, no matter how much power he thought he wielded, the heart of humanity would never be extinguished. Not while people like Alara still fought. And with that, the final stand began. The wind had picked up, sweeping through the ruins of London with a kind of brutal force, as if nature itself was attempting to erase the scars left by humanity's conflict. Alara stood at the edge of the barricade, watching the survivors approach with a mix of hope and hesitation. Her fingers gripped the hilt of her weapon tightly, the cold metal grounding her in the present, even as her mind churned with the weight of everything that had led to this moment. The figure that stood before her, the one who had called himself the leader of the new order, had not moved an inch since their initial confrontation. He stood in the middle of the shattered city, just beyond the line of barricades, the light of a dying sun casting a long shadow over him. He was tall, his face etched with a hardness that only years of surviving the collapse of civilization could carve into a man. But there was more to him than just the hardness. There was a fire, an unrelenting will that was dangerous, and Alara had learned long ago that people like him didn't relent easily. How many? Alara asked, her voice steady but sharp, cutting through the air between them. The man didn't respond at first, his eyes scanning the horizon as though the very thought of answering her question was beneath him. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and cold. "You've got enough to fight for," he said, "but you don't have enough to win." Alara narrowed her eyes. His words had the weight of truth, but that truth was a threat, one she wasn't willing to accept. "We've fought through the worst," she said, her voice steady, "and we're still here. You may control the ruins, but you don't control humanity." "Humanity is broken," he retorted, his voice rising just a little, a flicker of anger breaking through his otherwise composed exterior. "What you see here, what's left, is just the remnants of a species too weak to save itself. It's not a phoenix rising from the ashes. It's just the ashes." Alara stepped forward, closing the distance between them. She felt the air between them crackle with tension, like the calm before a storm. She could see it in his eyes. He didn't understand. He didn't understand what humanity was, what it had always been. "You're wrong," she said, each word a force of conviction. "What's left is a fire, not ashes. And that fire is why we'll rebuild. We may have been burned, but we will rise again. Because we're human, and that means we don't give up. Not now, not ever." The man sneered, his expression full of disdain. "You think it's that simple? You think hope is enough to win this? Hope won't bring back the billions we lost. Hope won't turn the tide against the Othran. Hope doesn't rebuild a broken world." Alara held his gaze, refusing to let him break her. "Maybe hope doesn't rebuild a world," she said softly, "but hope brings people together. Hope keeps them fighting. And fighting is what will save us. Fighting is the only thing we've ever known." For a moment, the man was silent, his eyes searching hers as if trying to find any trace of weakness. Alara didn't let him. She had seen too much, lost too much, to be broken by his words. Finally, he sighed, the anger draining from him, replaced by something colder, resignation, perhaps. "You don't get it, do you?" he asked. "You think you're the last stand of humanity, but you're not. You're just one last desperate gasp of a species doomed to extinction. The Othran aren't our only threat. We've become our own worst enemy." His words lingered in the air, and for a moment, Alara felt the weight of them. She had heard it before, from other survivors. The idea that humanity was too fractured, too divided, to ever heal. That the selfishness, the violence, the greed that had once driven their wars would be their ultimate downfall. That even if they survived the Othran, they would be destroyed by their own kind. But Alara knew something that this man didn't. Humanity had always been at its best when it was fighting for something greater than itself. When it had been forced to come together against impossible odds, it had found strength in its unity. The fire beneath the ashes wasn't just the desperate flame of survival. It was the fire of a people who refused to surrender. It was the fire of hope. And hope, she believed, was far stronger than any weapon. "You think we're done?" Alara said, her voice rising now, filled with the passion she had kept locked inside for so long. "You think this is the end? You don't know what humanity is. We're a force of nature. We'll rebuild this world, and we'll do it together. Because that's what we do. We rise." The man stared at her for a long moment, his eyes hard, like steel. There was no smile, no acknowledgement of her words. He only nodded slowly, his gaze lingering on her with something that might have been respect, or maybe just calculation. "Then prove it," he said finally, his voice colder now than it had ever been. Show me that you're not just wasting time. Show me that this world is worth saving. The words hung between them, a challenge. Alara didn't flinch. She didn't need to. She had heard his challenge, and it was the same challenge humanity had faced throughout history. A challenge to prove that they were worth saving, worth fighting for. And she knew one thing. Humanity had always proved it. Prepare for battle, she said, her voice firm. And when we win, you'll understand what humanity truly is. The battle was not what Alara had expected. The survivors, those who had pledged allegiance to the man who had declared himself their leader, were not the scattered, disorganized group she had imagined. They were disciplined, coordinated. Even in the midst of destruction, they had found a way to stand firm, to create order out of chaos. But they were still human. And like all humans, they were driven by fear, by their need to protect what they had left. In the end, it was that fear that would be their undoing. The sound of gunfire echoed through the ruins, a reminder of the violence humanity had lived with for far too long. But Alara felt no fear. Instead, she felt the heat of the fire that burned inside her, the same fire that had fueled every battle, every sacrifice. It was the fire of survival, the fire of the human spirit. They fought with everything they had left. Every person in Alara's team, every survivor who had come together under the banner of hope, stood their ground. They fought for the future. In the chaos of the battlefield, Alara found herself face to face with the man, the leader of the faction. His weapon was raised, his eyes burning with the same fire that had driven him to this point. But Alara saw something else in his eyes now, something she hadn't seen before: doubt. He was losing. The battle had already begun to turn in their favor. The survivors, unified, were gaining ground. But the man didn't retreat. He stood his ground, refusing to admit defeat. Alara, Kira's voice came over the comms, a burst of static and urgency. We're breaking through. We've got them on the run. Alara nodded, her heart steady. She didn't need to hear the rest. She knew what had to be done. She turned toward the man, who was still standing there, his gaze unwavering, his weapon aimed at her. And in that moment, she knew something he didn't. This fight wasn't about him. It wasn't about the war he had fought to build or the vision of the world he had tried to create. This fight was about something greater, about the people, the survivors, the ones who had been fighting for so long. It was about the fire that refused to be extinguished. With a final, silent breath, Alara moved toward him. It wasn't with anger or hatred, but with a quiet resolve. She wasn't going to kill him, but she was going to make him see. She was going to make him understand that humanity wasn't finished. It had never been finished. The fire burned, and it would always burn. And in the end, the fire was stronger than any weapon. The sky over Earth had been broken for so long. The world, once vibrant and full of life, was now nothing more than a scattered puzzle, pieces lost in a vast sea of ash and rubble. But even in the desolation, something remained, a faint pulse beneath the wreckage, a heartbeat that refused to be silenced. Alara could feel it, as sure as she could feel her own breath. The world was broken, yes, but it wasn't gone. Not yet. The battle had been hard, harder than anything she had ever faced. The remnants of humanity were divided, each group grasping at their own vision of what the future should be. Some, like the faction she had fought against, believed in power. They believed in control. They thought that the way forward was through strength, through the crushing of everything that stood in their way. But Alara knew that the future wasn't built on power alone. It was built on something more. It was built on hope, on connection, on the unshakable belief that even in the darkest times, humanity could rise, could rebuild, could find its way out of the ashes. She stood on the balcony of the Aegis, the wind cold against her skin, staring out at the world below. The city that had once been a symbol of humanity's progress, of everything they had achieved, now lay in ruins. But there was still something here, something worth saving. Kira stepped up beside her, the silence between them speaking volumes. Neither of them had words for what had just transpired. The battle had been brutal, but in the end, it wasn't just their weapons that had won. It had been their resolve, their determination to protect what they had left. It had been the fire that burned inside them all, the fire that refused to be snuffed out, no matter how many times it had been tested. We did it, Kira said, her voice quiet, as though she were afraid to break the stillness. Alara didn't respond immediately. Her eyes remained fixed on the horizon, on the wreckage of a city that could never be rebuilt in the same way. But that didn't mean it couldn't rise again. The people who had survived had shown them all that there was still strength in the bones of humanity. And now, it was up to them to decide what to do with that strength. How many? Alara asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Kira took a deep breath, her gaze flicking to the ground. Too many, but there's still hope. There are people out there who want to rebuild, people who are willing to fight for something better. Alara nodded slowly, absorbing the weight of Kira's words. Hope. The word had always felt too fragile, too fleeting in a world that seemed determined to tear itself apart. But after everything, after the war with the Othran, after the devastation, there was still something left. The people who had fought, the ones who had bled and died for a chance to make things right, they weren't just fighting for survival anymore. They were fighting for the future. And that future wasn't just about saving Earth. It was about saving humanity. The decision had been made. The faction that had once held control was no more. The leader had been defeated, not by the might of weapons or force, but by the one thing that he had underestimated: the heart of humanity. The belief that, no matter how far they had fallen, they could rise again. And now, as the last remnants of his group were driven back, Alara could feel the weight of what came next. The responsibility of rebuilding, of creating something that could honor those who had fallen and protect those who remained. What now? Kira asked, breaking through Alara's thoughts. Alara turned to face her, and in that moment, she saw the question wasn't just directed at the war or the survivors or the rebuilding of Earth. It was a question about something deeper, something more personal. What came after this? What came after everything they had fought for? After the devastation? After the loss? Alara didn't know. Not really. But she knew this. It would take time. Time to heal. Time to rebuild. And most importantly, time to remember. We rebuild, Alara said, her voice firm but gentle. We gather the survivors. We create new communities. We teach them what it means to hope again. And if they won't listen? Kira asked, her brow furrowed, her voice tinged with the reality of what they still faced. Alara's gaze hardened, but there was a warmth in her expression. Then we show them. We show them what hope looks like, what it means to fight for each other, to work together, to believe in something bigger than ourselves. Kira nodded, her eyes thoughtful. And if the Othran come back? Alara turned back to the horizon, to the world they had sworn to protect. Then we fight again. But this time, we're ready. And this time, we won't be fighting alone. The days that followed were a blur of movement. The survivors were still reeling, still coming to terms with the loss of everything they had known. But they were also coming together. Slowly, piece by piece, they were rebuilding. New alliances were formed, old wounds slowly starting to heal as people found common ground in their shared suffering. The Aegis became more than just a ship. It became a symbol of resilience, of the refusal to let the world crumble into dust. And as Alara and her team worked with the survivors, they started to piece together the broken fragments of Earth, bit by bit. It wasn't easy. It wasn't quick. But they had time. Time to rebuild. Time to remember. Alara spent hours among the survivors, listening to their stories, their hopes, their fears. She saw the same fire in their eyes that she had seen in her own, the fire that refused to go out. They were scarred, broken, yes, but they were alive. And as long as they were alive, they had a chance. She found herself walking through the remnants of what had once been a park, a place she remembered visiting with her family before the war. The trees were gone, the grass burned away, but there was something beautiful in the way nature was beginning to creep back. Small patches of green, delicate flowers poking through the cracked earth. It was a reminder that even in the most destroyed places, there was always the potential for new life. Alara. Kira's voice came from behind her, pulling her from her thoughts. Alara turned to find her friend standing there, a weary but determined look on her face. What is it? We've got a message, Kira said, her voice softer now. From the survivors. They're ready to follow you, to rebuild. Alara's heart swelled at the words, but the weight of it all still hung heavy on her shoulders. She wasn't ready to lead a new world. Not yet, but she knew she didn't have to do it alone. They were all in this together. They had been broken, but they weren't defeated. Not by a long shot. Then we start, Alara said, her voice filled with quiet resolve. We start building a future, one piece at a time. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the world in a soft, golden glow, Alara stood at the edge of the Aegis, looking out over the ruins. There was still so much work to do, so many battles to fight. But for the first time in a long while, she felt the stirrings of something else, something deeper than the fight, something that had been buried beneath the weight of everything they had endured. It was hope. They weren't just survivors. They were the beginning of something new. And no matter how broken the world was, no matter how long it took, they would rebuild it together. And as Alara watched the stars above, she knew that the heart of humanity, the fire that had burned for so long, was still alive, and it would never be extinguished. Not now, not ever. The future, though uncertain, was theirs to shape, and that was all that mattered.